The mountain man hasn't seen a woman for years until a naked, obese woman appeared crying at his door. The snow howls against the cabin walls. Inside, a hardened recluse sharpens his knife, believing his life will end in silence. Then a pounding. At the door. He opens it to find a woman, stripped, shivering, abandoned, and carrying a secret that could change the fate of the valley forever. She isn't just a lost soul hidden in her hair, or papers that greedy men would kill to possess. The railroad wants her gone. Our own kin want her dead. And the mountain man, who swore he'd never love again, now stands between her and the storm. In a land where law bends to power and mercy is rare as spring rain, one choice will decide it all. Protect the woman who could save his soul, or lose her to the wilderness forever. Will he risk everything to guard her secret or watch or vanish like snow on the wind? Before we begin, send a quick wave in the comments. Tell me your city, your country, your vibe. It's amazing how stories like this echo across the world. Stephen McCord's hands trembled as he stoked the fire, adding another split log. The woman's ragged breathing filled his small cabin, competing with the howl of the winter wind outside. He hadn't been this close to another soul in nearly a decade, let alone a woman in such desperate circumstances. The buffalo robe rose and fell with each of her shallow breaths. Her face, though pale from cold, had a gentle beauty that stirred something deep in his chest, something he thought had died with his Sarah all those years ago. He shook the feeling away and focused on practical matters. The worn floorboards creaked beneath his boots as he moved to check her pulse again. Her skin felt warmer now, thank the Lord, but she was still far too cold. Stephen ladled more broth from the pot hanging over the fire, the liquid gleaming amber in the firelight. "Ma'am?" He kept his voice soft, not wanting to startle her. "Miss Carter? You need to drink some more of this." Louise's eyes fluttered open, confusion clouding them before fear took hold. She tried to sit up, clutching the buffalo robe tight around herself. "Easy now," Stephen said, setting the cup aside and raising his palms to show he meant no harm. "You're safe here. I'm Stephen McCord. You collapsed at my door, remember?" Recognition slowly dawned on her face, followed by a deep flush of shame. I remember." Her voice was barely a whisper. "They left me, my own kin." A sob caught in her throat. Stephen's jaw tightened. What kind of people would abandon a woman to freeze in the mountains? "Here," he said, offering the cup again. Small sips. Louise's hand shook as she took the broth, but she managed a few swallows. "Thank you, Mr. McCord. I don't know how I can ever repay your kindness. No need for thanks. Couldn't leave you out there to freeze." He busied himself adding another log to the fire, uncomfortable with her gratitude. "Think you can tell me what happened?" Tears welled in her eyes. "My relatives, the Whitcombs, they brought me west, said they'd help me claim my inheritance, some land in the valley." She paused, drawing a shuddering breath. "But they wanted it for themselves. When I wouldn't sign it over, they. Stephen's hands clenched into fists as Louise broke down sobbing. The Whitcombs, he'd heard of them. Failed ranchers with a mean reputation. "They stripped me bare," she finally continued, shame coloring her words. "Said nobody would want to help someone like me, someone so large. Left me to die in the snow." Her voice cracked. "Maybe they were right. I've always been a burden." "No." The word came out sharper than he intended, surprising them both. Stephen softened his tone. "No one deserves that kind of cruelty, Miss Carter. Size don't matter a whit to decent folk." The fire popped and crackled in the silence that followed. Louise's eyes, red-rimmed but grateful, met his. "You're a good man, Mr. McCord." He grunted, uncomfortable with the praise. "Got some old clothes might work for now. My Sarah's." He stopped, the name sticking in his throat. He hadn't spoken it aloud in years. That understanding softened Louise's face. Your wife? Stephen nodded, unable to speak for a moment. Been gone 10 years now. He moved to the trunk in the corner, his movements stiff. Kept her things. Never could bring myself to. He trailed off, lifting the lid. The scent of cedar and memories washed over him as he pulled out a dress and shawl. His hands lingered on the familiar fabric before he brought them to Louise. Much obliged, she said softly, understanding in her eyes. I'll treat them with care. Stephen turned his back to give her privacy, listening to the rustle of fabric and the constant moan of the wind outside. His thoughts churned like the snowdrifts beyond his walls. This woman's arrival had already cracked open doors in his heart he thought forever sealed. Mr. McCord? Louise's voice drew him back. She sat wrapped in both the dress and buffalo robe, looking warmer but exhausted. I hate to impose further, but you'll stay here tonight, he said firmly. Storm's still raging. We can figure out the rest tomorrow. Relief flooded her face. Thank you. I was so afraid, out there in the cold. Thought I was going to die. Her voice quavered. When I saw your light, it was like an answer to prayer. Stephen turned back to the fire, unable to meet her eyes. He hadn't thought about prayers or answers in far too long. But something about Louise's presence made him wonder if perhaps the Lord wasn't quite finished with him yet. Get some rest, Miss Carter, he said gruffly. You're safe now. As Louise settled back onto his bedroll near the fire, Stephen took up his post in the rocking chair, rifle across his lap. The storm raged on outside, but inside his cabin, something long frozen had begun to thaw. Morning light filtered through the cabin's frosted window panes, casting a pale glow across Louise's face. She stirred beneath the buffalo robe momentarily, disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings. The events of the previous night crashed back like a wave, and her cheeks flushed deep red as she clutched the robe tighter around herself. Stephen McCord had dozed in his rocking chair, rifle still balanced across his knees. At her movement, his eyes snapped open, then quickly darted away from her. He cleared his throat and stood, joints creaking from the long night. I'll, get the fire going proper, he mumbled, keeping his gaze fixed on the hearth where the embers still glowed. His calloused hands moved with practiced efficiency, adding kindling and small logs until flames licked upward once more. Louise sat up slowly, making sure she stayed well covered. Mr. McCord, her voice caught as tears welled up unexpectedly. I don't even know how to begin thanking you. No need, he said gruffly, still not looking directly at her. Anyone would have done the same. No, Louise whispered, wiping her eyes. They wouldn't. My own flesh and blood left me to die. A sob escaped her throat. My Uncle Elias and Aunt Clara, they seemed so kind at first, offering to help me claim my inheritance. Stephen's shoulders tensed as he stood by the fire, listening. But they kept making comments about my size, how no one would want me around. Louise's words tumbled out between sobs. Yesterday, they insisted I get out of the wagon to help check something. When I did, they grabbed my clothes, pushed me down, took everything. Even stole the wagon seat so I couldn't climb. Back in, her voice broke. They laughed as they drove away, saying no one would help someone like me. Stephen's hands clenched into white-knuckled fists. The Whitcombs, he growled, known for being mean as snakes. He turned toward his trunk, movements stiff with anger. Got something here might help. He opened the cedar chest with careful reverence. The scent of mothballs and memories wafted out as he lifted a folded dress of dark blue calico. Was Sarah's my wife's, he explained, voice rough. Not much, but it's clean. Oh, Mr. McCord, I couldn't possibly. Please, he interrupted, still holding out the dress. Been sitting here too long anyway. Louise accepted the garment with trembling hands. Thank you. Truly, she examined the dress with care. Your wife must have been a fine seamstress. These stitches are so even. Stephen nodded once, throat too tight for words. He turned his back, giving her privacy to dress. It's a bit snug, Louise admitted after a few moments, embarrassment coloring her voice. But it's warm, and that's what matters. Reckon so. Stephen busied himself at the cook stove, setting a pot of broth to heat. Need to get some food in you. Louise settled back onto the buffalo robe, arranging the dress as best she could. The Lord must have guided me here, she said softly. I was so lost in that storm, nearly frozen through. Then I saw your light like an answer to prayer. Stephen's movements faltered. Ain't talked to God in years, he muttered. Not since Sarah. He left the sentence unfinished, focusing on stirring. The broth. Broth. Sometimes he answers even when we're not speaking to him, Louise offered gently. Stephen grunted non-committally and handed her a tin cup of steaming broth. Their fingers brushed briefly during the exchange, causing them both to start at the unexpected. Contact. Louise sipped carefully at the hot liquid. With each swallow, more color returned to her cheeks. The cabin grew quiet except for the pop and crackle of the fire and the whistle of wind through the eaves. Stephen found himself stealing glances at his unexpected guest. It had been so long since another person had occupied his space. The cabin felt different, somehow warmer, despite the winter's chill pressing against the walls. Something long dormant stirred in his chest, an emotion he couldn't quite name. This is good broth, Louise said, breaking the silence. You must be quite the cook. Just rabbit and roots, he replied, embarrassed by the praise. Nothing special. After merely freezing to death, it tastes like the finest meal in Denver. She attempted a small smile, though her eyes still held shadows of her ordeal. Stephen nodded, watching as she finished the broth. The morning light caught the silver threads in her dark hair, reminding him of how Sarah's had started to gray just before. He pushed the thought away, focusing instead on practical matters. Storm's blown itself out, he said, glancing toward the window. Once you're stronger, we can figure out what to do about them Whitcombs. Louise's hands tightened around the empty cup. You've already done so much. I couldn't ask. Ain't asking, Stephen interrupted. Can't let them get away with what they did. His voice softened slightly. Besides, you got an inheritance to claim, if I heard right. Tears welled in Louise's eyes again, but this time they were accompanied by a genuine smile. Mr. McCord, you truly are a godsend. Stephen turned back to the stove, uncomfortable with her gratitude yet somehow warmed by it. The cabin felt alive again, in a way it hadn't for 10 long years. He wasn't sure what to make of that feeling, but for now, he had a purpose, helping this woman who'd stumbled out of the storm and into his solitary life. Evening crept over the mountains, drawing long shadows across Stephen's cabin. Fresh snow had been falling steadily since noon, building drifts against the log walls that seemed to whisper of isolation. Inside, the fire cast dancing light across rough-hewn beams as Louise held her hands toward its warmth. Her fingers, still pink from their brush with frostbite, trembled slightly as she worked them closer to the flames. The borrowed dress pulled tight across her shoulders as she leaned forward, but she'd stopped fidgeting with it hours ago. There were bigger concerns weighing on her mind. Stephen noticed her distraction as he spooned out their supper of beans and salt pork. Something's troubling you, he said. It wasn't quite a question. Louise nodded slowly, her eyes fixed on the fire. Mr. McCord, there's something I haven't told you. She reached up to her disheveled hair, fingers working at the tangled bun that had somehow survived her ordeal in the storm. Stephen watched, puzzled, as she carefully extracted several folded papers from within the mess of pins and dark strands. The documents were creased but intact, protected from the snow by her improvised hiding place. "These are why they tried to kill me," she said softly, smoothing the papers across her knee. "Land grant deeds and letters from my father. They prove I'm the rightful heir to Shadow Valley." Stephen nearly dropped his tin plate. "Shadow Valley?" His voice was hoarse. "That's prime grazing land. Been nothing but trouble since the railroad started sniffing around." Louise nodded. "The surveyor, Thomas Gray, he's been pressuring everyone to sell. Says the railroad's coming through no matter what." She traced the edge of one yellow document with a trembling finger. "But the Ute people still hunt therein. Summer. It's part of their traditional grounds." "Caught between railroad men and Indians," Stephen muttered. "That's a dangerous place to be." "The Utes have been peaceful," Louise insisted. "They just want to keep their hunting rights." "But Mr. Gray," she shuddered. "He's not a man who takes no for an answer." A wolf's howl echoed from the darkness beyond the cabin walls, followed by another, closer. The sound made Louise jump, clutching the papers to her chest. "That's why Elias and Clara did this to me," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "They've been meeting with Gray. I heard them planning to sell as soon as they could get control of the deeds." Tears welled in her eyes. "My own relatives, willing to leave me to freeze just for money." Stephen stood abruptly, pacing the small cabin. Having Louise here had already complicated his carefully ordered life. Now he learned that sheltering her might bring the railroad's attention, or worse. His hands clenched and unclenched as he moved. The wolves called again, their voices carrying clear through the snowy night. Inside the cabin, the fire popped and hissed, throwing sparks up the chimney. Louise watched him pace, her face drawn with worry. "I'm sorry, Mr. McCord. I should have told you sooner. I'll understand if you want me to leave." But her voice quavered on the last word, betraying her fear. Stephen stopped by the window, staring out at the darkness. Without meaning to, he found himself forming words he hadn't spoken in 10 years. "Lord, what should I do?" The prayer rose silent in his mind, surprising him with its familiar comfort. "I have nowhere else to go," Louise whispered, her words barely audible above the fire's crackle. "The nearest town is 2 days' ride, and the Whitcombs will be watching for me there." Stephen's shoulders tensed as he struggled with his choice. Turning away from the window, he crossed to the woodpile and selected a solid log. The familiar weight of it steadied him as he considered what harboring Louise might cost. The wolves howled once more, but their voices were fainter now, moving away into the night. Stephen placed the log carefully on the fire, watching as flames licked up around its sides. Sparks rose in a fresh dance toward the chimney. He thought of Sarah, of how she'd always helped those in need, no matter the cost. The memory didn't hurt quite as sharply as usual. "You'll stay," he said finally, his voice rough but certain. "We'll figure something out come morning." Louise's shoulders sagged with relief. "Thank you," she breathed, carefully refolding the precious documents. "I don't know how I'll ever repay your kindness." Stephen shook his head, uncomfortable with her gratitude. "Let's get some rest. Tomorrow we'll need to plan how to handle them Whitcombs and whatever else might come looking for those papers." The fire settled around the new log with a soft sigh, casting warm light over them both as the snow continued falling outside, blanketing the world in pristine white. The days stretched together in a white blur as the storm refused to release its grip on the mountains. Snow piled against the cabin's walls, turning the windows into squares of clouded ice. Inside, Stephen and Louise fell into an unexpected rhythm of shared survival. "Like this," Stephen demonstrated, showing Louise how to split kindling with the hatchet. "Keep your thumb clear of the blade and let the weight do the work." His gruff voice had softened over the past few days, the edge of loneliness wearing away. Louise's face scrunched in concentration as she copied his motion. The wood split cleanly, and her face lit up with pride. I did it. She gathered the pieces into her apron, careful not to drop any. Reckon you did, Stephen agreed, fighting back a smile. He couldn't remember the last time he taught anyone anything. Later that afternoon, while Stephen mended a pair of snowshoes, delicious smells began wafting from the crude hearth. Louise had discovered a forgotten sack of flour in the pantry and set about making flatbread, working the dough with practiced hands. My mama taught me to bake when I was just a girl, she explained, patting the rounds flat. Said every woman should know how to make bread, even if she ain't got proper yeast. The bread came out golden brown, filling the cabin with warmth and the promise of home. Stephen couldn't remember when he'd last tasted anything so good. You've got a gift, he said, between bites, meaning it. Louise blushed, pleasure lighting her face. It's nothing special. Just flour and water, really. But her eyes shone at the praise. As evening settled in, Louise began humming as she tidied up their supper things. The tune was familiar, an old hymn Stephen remembered from better days. Without seeming to think about it, she began to sing. Softly, Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. Her voice was clear and sweet, filling the cabin with unexpected beauty. Stephen's hands stilled on the trap he was repairing. Something long frozen inside him began to thaw, bringing an ache he thought he buried with Sarah. The peaceful moment shattered at a knock on the door. Stephen grabbed his rifle, but a familiar voice called out, "Stephen McCord." "It is Henry Black Elk. I come as friend." Stephen lowered the weapon and opened the door to find Henry on snowshoes, his dark eyes serious above his frost-covered scarf. Snow swirled in behind him as he stepped inside, stamping his feet clean. "Word spreads," Henry said without preamble, nodding respectfully to Louise. "Smoke from your chimney tells stories. People wonder why the mountain man is not alone anymore." Louise wrapped her shawl tighter, shrinking back toward the fire. Stephen's jaw tightened. "Folks ought to mind their own business." "Railroad men do not mind their business," Henry replied. "Thomas Gray sends scouts into the valley, even in snow. They ask questions in town." He turned to Louise, his manner gentle but direct. "You are the one they seek, yes? The one with papers for Shadow Valley?" Louise nodded, her face pale. "How did you know?" "The wind carries whispers. I hear your relatives speak with Gray. Tell him you have documents he wants." Henry's dark eyes held sympathy. "The valley is sacred to my people. We do not want railroad there. But Gray does not listen to you words." Stephen ran a hand through his beard, troubled. "Thought the snow would buy us more time. But if folks are already talking, some neighbors saw smoke," Henry confirmed. "Wonder why Stephen McCord's chimney burns so bright now. Soon, others will wonder too." Louise's hands twisted in her apron. "I've brought trouble to your door, Mr. McCord." "I never meant." "None of that," Stephen cut her off gruffly. "You needed help. Still do." He turned to Henry. "Much obliged for the warning, friend." Henry nodded, adjusting his scarf. "I must go. More snow comes tonight." He paused at the door, looking back at Louise. "You have strong spirit to survive the storm. Perhaps you are meant to guard the valley, as your papers say." With that, he slipped out into the gathering darkness. Stephen bolted the door behind him. Mind churning. The peaceful routine they'd built felt suddenly fragile. Louise stood by the fire, her face troubled in the flickering light. "What will we do?" she whispered. "We'll think of something," Stephen assured her, though worry gnawed at his gut. He added another log to the fire, watching the flames leap up. Outside, the wind picked up, driving snow against the walls of their shelter. Louise began humming again, softer now, as if to hold back the darkness. Stephen found himself listening, letting the gentle sound wash over him. Whatever came next, he knew he couldn't send her away. Somehow, in just these few days, she'd worked her way past his defenses, bringing light back into his shadowed world. The morning dawned crisp and bright, the storm's fury finally spent. Sunlight sparkled across untouched drifts, and the wind had settled to a gentle whisper through the pines. Stephen stood at his cabin door, breathing in the sharp winter air. Perfect conditions for teaching Louise to snowshoe. These were Sarah's, he said gruffly, holding out a pair of wooden snowshoes. His wife's name felt strange on his tongue after so many silent years. Reckon they'll work for you. Louise ran her fingers over the webbed rawhide, her touch gentle. They're beautiful, but I might be too heavy for them. Nonsense, Stephen replied firmly. These'll hold just fine. Here, let me show you. He knelt and helped her strap the snowshoes to her boots, his calloused hands working carefully with the leather bindings. Rising, he demonstrated how to walk, lifting each foot and placing it down flat. Like a duck, Louise giggled, taking her first awkward steps. She wobbled, arms windmilling, but kept her balance. Oh my, this feels so strange. Stephen found himself grinning despite himself. You're doing fine. Just take it slow. They set out across the sparkling meadow, Stephen breaking trail while Louise followed in his tracks. Every few steps she'd stumble, but instead of getting frustrated, she laughed at herself, her joy echoing off the surrounding peaks. I never thought I'd be doing this, she called out, carefully placing each foot. My relatives always said I was too clumsy for anything but sitting in a corner. Stephen felt that familiar surge of anger at her family's cruelty, but Louise's next stumble and cheerful oops melted it away. Her determination to learn, to embrace this new challenge, stirred something in him he thought long dead. They made their way up the gentle slope to the ridge, taking frequent breaks to let Louise catch her breath. At the top, she gasped, clutching Stephen's arm. Oh, Mr. McCord, look at how beautiful it all is. Stephen followed her gaze across the valley. The fresh snow draped every branch of the towering pines, transforming them into crystalline sculptures. Sunlight caught the ice-covered limbs, setting the whole forest aglow. In the distance, mountain peaks pierced the sky so blue it hurt to look at. I see it every day, he said quietly. Guess I forgot how to really look. How could anyone ever forget this? Louise breathed, her face radiant. It's like God painted everything just for us to find this morning. Stephen studied her profile, seeing how the winter light softened her features, how her eyes sparkled with wonder. He'd grown so used to seeing the mountains as merely shelter, a place to hide from the world. Through Louise's eyes, they became magical again, full of beauty and possibility. The trek back to the cabin went faster, Louise growing more confident with each step. By the time they reached home, both were ready for a hot meal. Stephen set about preparing the rabbit he'd snared the day before, while Louise kneaded dough for dumplings. The stew bubbled fragrantly, filling the cabin with savory warmth. They ate in comfortable silence, sharing the crusty bread Louise had baked. As the light outside faded to purple dusk, she spoke softly. Can I tell you something, Mr. McCord? He nodded, watching her face in the firelight. I used to dream about having a home where I belonged, she said, her fingers twisting in her apron, where nobody pointed or whispered about my size. Where? Maybe somebody might even, she paused, swallowing hard, might even cherish me, just as I am. The simple honesty in her words struck Stephen like a physical blow. How long had it been since anyone had trusted him with their heart's truth? He stared into the flames, not trusting himself to speak. Foolish dreams, I suppose, Louise continued, her voice barely a whisper. But sometimes dreams are all that keep us going, aren't they? Stephen rose to bank the fire for the night, his movements deliberate as he arranged the logs. Behind him, Louise began humming softly as she cleared their bowls. The familiar domestic sounds filled the cabin, spoon clinking against pot, water, splashing, the crackle of settling wood. His home felt alive again. Not just shelter from the elements, but a true home with warmth beyond what any fire could provide. He watched Louise dry her hands on her apron, saw how she moved with growing confidence through his space, and felt something shift deep in his heart. This woman, who'd arrived at his door like a half-frozen angel, had brought more than just company to his solitary life. She'd brought courage in the face of cruelty, laughter despite pain, and an ability to see beauty in the everyday world. Without meaning to, she'd awakened feelings he'd thought forever buried in Sarah's grave. Stephen added another log to the fire, letting its warmth wash over him. For the first time in 10 years, he felt truly awake to life's possibilities. Sunday morning dawned clear and cold. Stephen hitched his old mule, Jasper, to the wooden sled while Louise wrapped herself in extra blankets against the biting wind. The thought of attending church made his stomach knot. He hadn't set foot in the settlement's schoolhouse church since Sarah's funeral. "You sure about this?" he asked, helping Louise settle onto the sled's rough bench. "The Lord's Day shouldn't be spent alone," she replied, tucking the blankets tighter. "Besides, I miss singing with others." Stephen clicked his tongue, and Jasper lurched forward, sending the sled gliding over packed snow. The morning sun cast long shadows across the pristine drifts, while their breath frosted in the air. Louise hummed softly, her voice carrying on. The winter breeze died as they approached the settlement. Smoke rose from scattered chimneys. The schoolhouse sat at the heart of the community, its bell tower reaching toward heaven. Stephen's hands tightened on the reins when he spotted folks already gathering, their heads turning at the sound of his approaching sled. "Well, I'll be," someone muttered as Stephen helped Louise down. "McCord's finally come back." Whispers rippled through the crowd. Women gathered in clusters, stealing glances at Louise. Men nodded awkwardly at Stephen, clearly surprised to see the hermit in their midst. He guided Louise toward the door, his protective instinct rising at each curious stare. Inside, oil lamps cast a warm glow over rough-hewn pews. Louise chose a spot near the middle, and Stephen slid in beside her, hyper-aware of the attention they drew. The familiar scent of pine soap and wool clothing brought memories flooding back Sarah beside him, their hands clasped in prayer. Reverend Parker's eyebrows rose at the sight of Stephen, but recovered quickly. "Welcome, brothers and sisters," he began, his voice carrying to the rafters. "Let us lift our voices in praise." When the first hymn began, Louise's voice rose clear and strong above the congregation. Stephen watched in amazement as she sang without hesitation, her face glowing with joy. The pure, sweet notes of Amazing Grace filled every corner of the room. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. Her voice carried such emotion that several women dabbed at their eyes. Even gruff old ranchers like Tom Wilson softened, their weathered faces showing wonder. By the final verse, the entire congregation had fallen silent, letting Louise's voice soar alone. "When we've been there 10,000 years, bright shining as the sun." The last note faded into reverent silence. Reverend Parker cleared his throat, clearly moved. "The Lord surely blessed us with an angel's voice today," he said. Softly throughout the service, Stephen noticed a change in the way people looked at Louise. The initial whispers of curiosity transformed into warm glances and gentle smiles. After the final prayer, several women approached them, led by Martha Wilson, the rancher's wife. "We've got some spare fabric and shawls at home," Martha said, touching Louise's arm. "Would you accept them as a welcome gift?" Louise's eyes welled with tears. "That's so kind of you." "It's what neighbors do," another woman added firmly. Stephen stood back, chest swelling with pride, as he watched Louise chat with the women. Their easy acceptance lifted a weight he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. Even the men nodded respectfully as they filed past, several touching their hats to Louise. The ride home was peaceful, Jasper's steady gait carrying them through the lengthening afternoon shadows. Louise sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap, a gentle smile playing on her lips. Back at the cabin, Stephen built up the fire while Louise prepared their evening meal. The familiar domestic routine felt different now, charged with unspoken meaning. As they sat down to eat by lamplight, Louise finally spoke. "I haven't felt like I belonged anywhere for so long," she said softly, her eyes meeting Stephen's across the table. "Today in that church with those kind people," she paused, wiping a tear. "It felt like home." Stephen studied her face in the warm glow of the lamp. The lonely years that had wrapped around his heart like barbed wire were falling away, replaced by something both terrifying and wonderful. Louise's presence had transformed his cabin from a hermit's refuge into a true home, filled with warmth and hope. "You do belong," he said gruffly, surprising himself with the words. "Right here." Louise's smile was brighter than any lamplight. They finished their meal in comfortable silence, while outside, stars began to pierce the darkening sky. Stephen realized with startling clarity that his decade of solitude had ended the moment Louise collapsed at his door. Now, watching her clear away their dishes, humming that morning's hymn, he knew he never wanted to be alone again. The winter days settled into a gentle rhythm at Stephen's cabin. Morning light would find Louise at the cook stove, humming hymns, while cornmeal bubbled in the iron pot. Stephen would return from checking his trap lines, snow dusting his shoulders. Sometimes with a rabbit or a grouse for their evening meal. They worked side by side in comfortable silence, mending the deer hides. Stephen had tanned into proper clothing for Louise. Her fingers proved skilled with needle and sinew, despite their size. The new buckskin dress took shape slowly, panel by panel, each stitch stronger than the last. "My mama taught me to sew when I was just a girl," Louise said one afternoon, holding up her work to check the seams. "Said every woman needs to know how to make do with what she has." Stephen nodded, watching her sure movements. "You've got a gift for it." Their suppers became a time of stories shared over steaming bowls. Louise told tales of her childhood in Missouri, of climbing apple trees and helping her father in his general store. Stephen found himself speaking of things long buried, his own youth in Pennsylvania, learning trapping from his grandfather, the day he first saw the mountains rising like God's own cathedral. "I never thought I'd laugh again," Stephen admitted. One evening, wiping tears from his eyes after Louise described falling into a rain barrel while chasing her brother's cat. "Not since Sarah." Louise reached across the table and squeezed his hand. The touch was warm, comforting. "The Lord gives us joy again, even when we think it's lost forever." The peaceful routine shattered one evening just after sunset. Stephen was banking the fire when he heard hoofbeats approaching through the crusty snow. Louise froze at the window, her face going pale. "3 riders," she whispered. "2 with rifles." Stephen grabbed his own rifle from its pegs, checking the load. "Stay back from the windows." A sharp knock rattled the door. "McCord, open up in the name of the law." Stephen positioned himself carefully before cracking the door. 3 men sat their horses in the gathering dusk. The one in front wore a smart Eastern coat and derby hat, clearly the railroad surveyor, Thomas Gray. The other 2 were deputies, their badges catching the last light. "What brings you gentlemen out so late?" Stephen asked mildly, though his grip remained firm on his rifle. Gray's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Word is you're harboring a woman carrying fraudulent land papers. We've come to investigate these serious allegations." "Don't know nothing about fraud," Stephen replied. "And I don't recall inviting you inside my home." "Now see here," Gray leaned forward in his saddle. "You have authority on railroad land," Stephen cut in. "This here's my property, registered and paid for. Unless you've got a proper warrant, I reckon we're done talking." The deputy shifted uneasily, but Gray's face hardened. "You're making a mistake, McCord. That woman's causing trouble she can't handle. Best turn her over now, before things get difficult. Good evening, gentlemen." Stephen shut the door firmly, throwing the bar across it. Through the thick logs, he heard Gray curse, then the sound of horses turning away. When their hoofbeats faded, Louise emerged from the shadows, trembling. "They know I'm here. They'll come back." Stephen set his rifle down and took her hands in his. They were ice cold. "You're safe with me, Louise. I promise you that. But they have guns, authority." Tears spilled down her cheeks. "I never meant to bring such trouble to your door." "Trouble found me long before you did," Stephen said gruffly. "At least now it's worth facing." Louise managed a shaky smile, then sank to her knees beside the hearth. Clasping her hands, she began to pray aloud. "Dear Lord, grant us courage for the days ahead. Protect us from those who would do harm. Guide us in your wisdom and justice. And thank you, Father, for bringing me to this place, to this good man who has shown me such kindness." Stephen stood awkwardly, unused to such open faith after years of silence between him and God. Yet something in Louise's words stirred his heart. The simple trust in her voice reminded him of Sarah's prayers, of a time when he too believed so clearly in divine protection. As Louise's whispered "Amen" faded into the firelit quiet, Stephen found his own prayer rising unbidden. "Lord, help me keep her safe." The night settled around the cabin, deep and cold. Louise eventually retired to her pallet near the hearth, while Stephen sat in his chair, rifle across his knees, watching the darkness through the window. His heart felt strangely unsettled, yet stronger than it had in years. Whatever came next, he knew with bone-deep certainty that he would not let Louise face it alone. The late February thaw came suddenly, turning the pristine snow into patches of brown slush. Icicles dripped steadily from the cabin's eaves, and the afternoon sun gained strength enough to warm bare skin. As the paths cleared, more neighbors ventured out, their sleighs and wagons cutting dark trails through the melting drifts. One evening, while Louise tended a pot of venison stew, a knock echoed through the cabin. Stephen opened the door to find Henry Black Elk standing there, snowshoes slung across his back. "The evening brings good hunting," Henry said, offering a brace of fat winter grouse. "Much obliged," Stephen replied, stepping aside. "Join us for supper?" Louise brightened at the invitation, quickly setting another tin plate at their rough-hewn table. The cabin filled with warmth and savory aromas as they settled in to eat. Henry's dark eyes studied Louise thoughtfully over his bowl. "The valley you have papers for," he began carefully. "It holds great meaning for my people." Louise set down her spoon, giving him her full attention. "Please, tell me more." "For many generations, our healers have gathered sacred herbs there. The springs that feed the creek are blessed places where our young men seek visions." Henry's voice carried the weight of ancient tradition. When the railroad men came with their stakes and maps, they did not see these things. Stephen watched, Louise's face cloud with concern. "I had no idea," she said softly. "The deeds mention only grazing rights and water access. The white man's papers rarely speak of what cannot be bought or sold." Henry replied without bitterness, just stating the truth. Louise reached for the leather pouch where she kept her documents. "I don't want to be like those who take without thought," she declared. "This valley should be shared justly, not hoarded." Henry's expression softened. "Your words show a good heart. Many would think only of profit." "The Lord gave us this land to tend, not to fight over," Louise said firmly. "Surely there's a way we can honor both your people's sacred places and..." My small dream of a home? Stephen felt pride warm his chest at her words. This big-hearted woman had taught him more about grace in a few weeks than he'd learned in all his years of solitude. They talked long into the evening, Henry sharing stories of his people's connection to the valley, while Louise listened intently, asking thoughtful questions. When Henry finally departed, he clasped Louise's hand with respect. "You are different from others who have claimed this land," he said. "Perhaps the Creator has guided you here for a purpose." After Henry left, Louise and Stephen sat quietly by the fire. The flames painted shadows across their faces as each pondered the evening's revelations. "I've been so afraid," Louise finally whispered. "Afraid of what people would say about my size, afraid of being alone, afraid of failing. But maybe God had a bigger plan all along." Stephen stared into the flames, his throat tight. "Haven't talked to God much since Sarah died," he admitted roughly. Felt like he stopped listening. Louise's soft hand covered his calloused one. "God didn't leave you, did?" The simple truth of her words struck him like a physical blow. Stephen felt tears burning behind his eyes, tears he'd held back for 10 long years of grief and anger. "How do you keep such faith?" he asked hoarsely. "Because he's always there, even when we can't feel him." Louise squeezed his hand, like the sun behind storm clouds, waiting to warm us again. Stephen's chest ached with emotions he'd long buried. The loss of Sarah, the years of lonely isolation, the unexpected gift of Louise's arrival, it all welled up like a spring breaking through winter ice later that night. After Louise had retired to her pallet, Stephen found himself kneeling by the dying fire. His knees protested the unfamiliar position, and words came slowly, rusty from disuse. "Lord," he whispered, "I ain't sure you're still listening, but..." He paused, struggling. "Thank you for sending Louise, for showing me I was wrong to turn away, for," his voice cracked, "for giving me a reason to hope again." The prayer was short, halting, but it opened something long sealed in Stephen's heart. As he rose stiffly, he felt lighter somehow, as if a heavy burden had begun to shift. Outside, an owl called softly in the darkness. The sound reminded him of Sarah, who had loved watching the night birds. For the first time in years, the memory brought a smile instead of pain. Stephen added another log to the fire, watching Louise's peaceful sleeping face in the gentle light. The thaw outside matched the one in his heart, and he whispered a final, silent word of gratitude before seeking his own rest. The spring thaw turned the mountain paths into treacherous ribbons of mud. Wagon wheels sank deep into the mire, and horses struggled to keep their footing on the slick trails. Yet inside Stephen's cabin, hope bloomed like the first wildflowers pushing through melting snow. Each evening, Stephen and Louise huddled over rough maps spread across the wooden table. Their fingers traced possible boundaries where settlers' needs might meet Ute traditions with respect. Louise's eyes sparkled as she described her vision of shared gardens where both peoples could grow, healing herbs and grazing lands that would sustain both cattle and deer. "We could build a house here," she said one night, pointing to a gentle slope, far enough from the sacred springs to show respect, but close enough to tend the valley. Stephen watched her animated face in the lamplight, marveling at how she transformed problems into possibilities. The word "we" echoed in his mind, stirring feelings he thought long buried. One crisp morning, they climbed the ridge together to survey the valley below. The air held the fresh promise of spring, and patches of grass had begun showing through the retreating snow. Louise paused to catch her breath, her cheeks flushed with exertion, and the cool air Stephen steadied her with a gentle hand. Looking at her there, framed by the brightening sky, he felt his heart swell. The loneliness that had been his constant companion for 10 years melted away whenever she was near. He wanted this, wanted her by his side forever. He drew a deep breath, ready to speak words he never thought he would say again. But before he could form them, Louise grabbed his arm. "Riders," she whispered, her voice tight with sudden fear. In the distance, a group of horsemen wound their way up the valley trail. Stephen squinted against the morning sun, counting 6 riders. His stomach clenched as he recognized the lead figures. Familiar stance. Elias Whitcomb, Louise's relative, who had left her to die in the snow. "We need to get back to the cabin," Stephen said firmly, helping Louise down the steep path. They had barely reached the yard when hoofbeats thundered closer. Elias Whitcomb sat tall in his saddle, flanked by his wife Clara and 4 men wearing badges. Their horses' flanks were dark with sweat from the hard ride. "There's the thief!" Clara's sharp voice cut through the morning air. Hiding behind that mountain man like the coward she is. Louise seemed to shrink beside Stephen, her shoulders hunching as if to make herself smaller. The confidence she had shown moments before drained away. "We've come for the woman and the deed she stole," Elias announced, his voice carrying the weight of authority. He gestured to the lawman. "These gentlemen are here to ensure there's no trouble." Stephen stepped forward, placing himself between Louise and the riders. "The only theft here was leaving your own kin to freeze in the wilderness," he growled. "You've got no right to her or her property." "Property?" Clara's laugh was cruel. "Look at her. Too big to work, too stupid to manage land. She's nothing but a burden, living off others' charity." Louise made a small sound of pain behind him. Stephen could feel her trembling. "Those deeds belong to the family," Elias declared. "She's unfit to handle such responsibility. Everyone knows it. The only unfit people I see are the ones who'd strip a woman naked and leave her to die," Stephen spat back. But he could feel Louise withdrawing further with each barbed word. The confrontation stretched into the evening, with threats of arrest and legal action flying back and forth. Finally, the riders withdrew, promising to return with more authority. Behind them, Stephen turned to comfort Louise, but her eyes were distant, filled with shame. She barely spoke through their evening meal, pushing food around her plate without eating. "Don't let their words poison your heart," Stephen urged. "You're worth more than all of them combined." Louise nodded without meeting his eyes. "I think I'll turn in early," she whispered, retreating to her corner of the cabin. Stephen stayed up late, stoking the fire and planning how to protect her. But while he dozed in his chair, Louise moved silently in the darkness. She gathered only what she had arrived with, leaving behind the borrowed dress and the warmth she had brought to his home. In the gray light before dawn, Stephen woke to find her gone. A single piece of paper lay on the table, weighted down by a cup. His hand shook as he read the few words written in her careful script. "Forgive me. I'll not burden you. They're right about what I am. Thank you for your kindness." Stephen stared at the note, his world crumbling for the second time in his life. The cabin seemed to grow colder with each passing moment, as if all the warmth and hope Louise had brought was draining away with her departure. His legs gave out, and he sank to his knees beside the cold hearth, the note crumpling in his fist. The darkness he had held at bay these past weeks came rushing back, threatening to drown him in despair. Stephen stared at the empty cabin as dawn's weak light filtered through the windows. Louise's corner lay bare, her borrowed shawl and dress missing. Only the crumpled note remained, mocking him with its few painful words. His hands trembled as cold reality gripped him. She was gone. Outside, dark clouds rolled in from the west, bringing unseasonable spring snow. The wind picked up, rattling the cabin shutters with growing fury. Stephen's heart hammered against his ribs as he realized what this meant. Louise was out there, alone in another storm. "No," he whispered, "not again. I can't lose someone else." To the mountain, he burst into action, grabbing his heavy coat and rifle. In the barn, his old mule snorted as Stephen threw on the saddle with shaking hands. The first fat snowflakes began to fall as he mounted up, spurring the mule toward the nearest hunting trails. "Louise!" His voice cracked as he called into the strengthening wind. "Louise, come back!" The storm intensified with frightening speed. Soon the wet spring snow was falling so thick he could barely see 10 feet ahead. Stephen searched until his mule stumbled in exhaustion, checking every hollow and stand of trees where someone might seek shelter. Nothing. By mid-morning, the blizzard had turned the world white. Stephen's hands had gone numb, and his voice was hoarse from calling. With the mule struggling, he had no choice but to return to the cabin. He practically fell through his door, legs weak, from cold and fear. The empty cabin seemed to mock him as he collapsed beside the cold hearth. Hours passed as he sat there, head in his hands, paralyzed by memories of his wife's death and the thought of losing Louise too. "Lord," he whispered, his first proper prayer in years, "I know I turned my back on you, but please, don't let her die out there. Please." The cabin door burst open as evening approached. Henry Black Elk stood in the doorway, snow coating his shoulders. One look at Stephen's face told him everything. "I found tracks," Henry said without preamble. "They lead toward the ravine trail. She's trying to reach the valley, but in this storm, he left the deadly implications unspoken. Stephen grabbed his snowshoes from their peg. His body ached from the morning's failed search, but determination burned through his exhaustion. "Show me." "You'll die in this weather," Henry warned. "Then I die," Stephen said simply, strapping on the snowshoes. "But I won't abandon her like everyone else has." They moved through the deepening snow, Henry leading the way with his uncanny tracking ability. The wind howled around them, driving ice crystals into their faces. Stephen's muscles screamed in protest as they climbed higher into the mountains. With each step, memories of Louise flooded his mind. Her laughter as she learned to snowshoe, stumbling but never giving up. Her voice raised in hymns that brought tears to hardened men's eyes. Her gentle hands taking his as she encouraged him to pray again. The way she transformed his lonely cabin into a home filled with warmth and hope. "I can't lose her," he muttered, pushing through another drift. "Lord, please. I know I deserve your silence, but she doesn't. She still believes. She still sees your grace everywhere." The storm intensified as darkness fell. Henry signaled they should turn back, but Stephen pressed on, checking his lantern's flame. Through the swirling snow, something caught his eye, a splash of color against the white. His heart stopped as he reached for it. Louise's shawl, snagged on a pine branch, fluttering in the wind like a desperate flag. "Louise!" He screamed into the storm, his voice breaking. "Louise, hold on. I'm coming." The shawl's presence renewed his strength. Stephen plunged ahead, ignoring Henry's calls for caution. Somewhere in this deadly white chaos, Louise was fighting for survival. He would find her or die trying. With each step, he prayed harder than he had in 10 years. No formal words, just desperate pleas spilling from his heart. The God he had blamed for his wife's death now seemed his only hope for saving the woman who had brought love back into his life. The wind shrieked around him as he pressed forward into the storm's fury. Louise's shawl clutched in his frozen fingers like a lifeline. Ahead lay the dangerous ravine trail, treacherous even in good weather. If she had tried to follow it in the blizzard, Stephen's heart pounded as he raised the lantern higher, searching desperately through the curtain of white for any sign of movement, any hint of Louise's presence in this deadly wilderness. The bitter wind cut through Stephen's coat as he held the lantern higher, scanning the ravine's treacherous edge. Snow pelted his face, but he refused to turn back. Henry's warning calls faded behind him as he pressed forward, Louise's shawl still clutched in his frozen fingers. Then he saw it, a dark shape against the white drifts near the ravine's rim. His heart nearly stopped. "Louise!" The word tore from his throat as he stumbled forward through knee-deep snow. There she lay, half buried in white, her borrowed dress crusted with ice. Her face was deathly pale, lips tinged blue. Stephen dropped to his knees beside her, hands shaking as he brushed snow from her face. A faint warmth still clung to her skin, and the smallest whisper of breath stirred from her lips. She was alive, barely. "Thank you, Lord," he choked out, tears freezing on his cheeks. "Thank you." With trembling fingers, he wrapped her in his heavy coat. Louise's eyes fluttered, but didn't open as he gathered her into his arms. She felt so light, so fragile against his chest. "You are no burden," he whispered fiercely into her frost-matted hair. "You are my salvation. You brought life back to my empty world." His voice broke. "And I'm bringing you home." Stephen struggled to his feet, lifting Louise onto his back. The wind howled around them as he took the first stumbling steps away from the ravine. Each movement was agony through the deep drifts, but he pressed on, murmuring prayers and encouragement. "Stay with me, Louise. Just stay with me." Henry appeared through the swirling snow, taking the lantern to light their way. Together they fought through the storm, Stephen's world narrowing to the precious burden on his back and the next step forward. Hours blurred as they descended the mountain, the sky gradually lightening from black to steel gray. Dawn was breaking as they finally reached the cabin. Stephen's legs gave out as they crossed the threshold, and he collapsed to his knees, still cradling Louise. Henry immediately set to work, building up the fire while Stephen stripped off Louise's ice-crusted clothes with shaking hands. "Heated stones," Henry ordered, already warming river rocks in the flames. "And broth. She needs warmth from inside and out." They wrapped the hot stones in cloth, tucking them around Louise's body. Stephen held cup after cup of warm broth to her blue-tinged lips while Henry chafed her cold hands between his. Slowly, painfully slowly, color began returning to her face. The morning crept into afternoon. Stephen never left her side, his hand gripping hers as though he could anchor her to life through touch alone. Every shallow breath she took felt like a gift. "Please, Lord," he prayed openly, no longer caring who heard. "You led her to my door once. Don't take her from me now." As the sun passed its peak, Louise's eyelids finally fluttered. A soft moan escaped her lips as awareness returned. Tears slid down her pale cheeks as her gaze focused on Stephen's face. "I'm sorry," she whispered, voice barely audible. "I believed their cruel words. I thought I was nothing but trouble for you." "No." Stephen's voice was rough with emotion as he squeezed her hand. "Listen to me, Louise. No shame or cruel words will ever steal your hope again. I won't allow it." He brought her cold fingers to his lips. "You are precious to me. You brought light back into my life when I thought all light was gone." Louise's tears fell faster, but a tiny smile touched her lips. "I believe you," she whispered. Henry quietly stepped outside, leaving them alone. Stephen kept hold of Louise's hand, watching as color slowly returned to her face. The afternoon light streamed through the cabin windows, turning her hair to gold where it spread across the pillow. "Rest now," Stephen murmured, tucking the blankets more securely around her. "You're home. You're safe." Louise's eyes drifted closed, her breathing deep and even at last. But her fingers remained twined with his, holding on as though she'd never let go again. Stephen sat beside her, watching her sleep, his heart full of gratitude and love. The storm outside began to ease, but neither of them noticed. In the warm cabin, they had found something far more precious than shelter. They had found healing, hope, and the promise of tomorrow. Words spread through the valley like spring floodwater. By mid-morning, horses and wagons crowded the clearing. Around Stephen's cabin, townsfolk stood in clusters, their breath visible in the crisp air. Railroad agents in dark coats sat stiffly on their mounts, while Ute families gathered quietly near the tree line, Henry Black Elk standing respectfully. Between the groups dot inside, Louise smoothed her borrowed dress with trembling hands. The fever's pallor still clung to her cheeks, but determination burned in her eyes. "Are you certain about this?" Stephen asked softly, watching her gather the precious papers from their hiding place. "More certain than I've ever been," she replied, straightening her shoulders. They stepped onto the porch together, Stephen's hand steady at her elbow. The murmuring crowd fell silent. Louise's relatives, Elias and Clara Whitcomb, sneered from their wagon seat, but Louise lifted her chin and refused to shrink from their cruel stares. Thomas Gray, the railroad surveyor, urged his horse forward. "Miss Carter," he called, his voice sharp with false courtesy, "I trust you're prepared to be reasonable about this unfortunate situation." "I am indeed, Mr. Gray." Louise's voice carried clearly across the yard. She held up the leather folder containing her documents. "These deeds and letters prove my legal inheritance of this valley. Would you care to examine them?" Gray dismounted, snatching the papers with barely concealed contempt. His deputies crowded close as he rifled through them, his frown deepening. "These are obvious forgeries," he declared, though uncertainty flickered in his eyes. Henry Black Elk stepped forward, his presence commanding attention. "I knew the man who wrote those papers," he said quietly. "I guided him through this valley 20 years ago when he first marked these boundaries. His mark is true." A ripple of whispers passed through the crowd. Gray's face darkened. "The railroad has plans for this land. Progress cannot be stopped by questionable claims. The land is mine by law," Louise said firmly. She took back her documents, then turned to address everyone gathered. "But I have no wish to hoard it." Surprise rippled through the crowd. Stephen squeezed her hand, pride swelling in his chest as she continued. "To my neighbors who need grazing land for their herds, I offer fair access and reasonable rates." She turned to the Ute families, to the people who held this valley sacred long before any deeds were written. "I promise your rights to the ancient gathering places will be protected." Henry translated her words for the elders, who nodded with grave approval. Even the hardened ranchers muttered words of respect. Clara Whitcomb's face twisted with thwarted greed, while Elias slumped in defeat. Thomas Gray stepped forward, his voice cold. "You cannot expect the railroad to accept this arrangement." "The railroad," Louise replied steadily, "will need to find another route, one that doesn't steal from either settlers or the Ute people." Gray's face flushed dark red. Without another word, he swung onto his horse and spurred it roughly. His deputies followed, their retreat marking the end of the railroad's grip on the valley. The tension broke like ice in spring. Neighbors stepped forward to shake Louise's hand, offering words of support and gratitude. Ute mothers brought her small gifts of beadwork. Even some of the most stubborn ranchers nodded respectfully as they led their horses away. Stephen watched it all, marveling at how this woman he'd found half frozen in the snow had achieved what decades of fights and feuds could not. She had brought peace to the valley through simple justice and mercy. As the crowd dispersed, Louise sagged slightly against him, exhausted but smiling. "Thank you for believing in me," she whispered. Stephen wrapped his arm around her shoulders, supporting her as they watched the sun break through the clouds over their valley, where hope had finally taken root. Spring painted the valley in delicate greens and wildflower colors. The last patches of snow melted away, revealing tender grass shoots that made Stephen's horse snort with pleasure. After the harsh winter, the land seemed eager to celebrate renewal. Wagons rolled up to the cabin daily, bringing unexpected blessings. Martha Jenkins arrived with 3 quilts tucked under her arm, saying, "Every bride needs proper bedding." The Petersons brought a milk cow with a young calf at her side. Even crusty old Tom Wheeler contributed a sack of seed potatoes, muttering that good neighbors shared their harvest. Louise received each gift with grace that touched Stephen's heart. She wrote careful thank you notes, hosted visitors for coffee, and shared her plans for the valley's shared future. The same people who once whispered cruel words about her size now sought her counsel about grazing rights and water access. One evening, as the sunset painted the cabin walls gold, Stephen watched Louise kneading bread at the table. Her strong hands worked the dough with purpose, her face peaceful in the fading light. His fingers touched the silver ring in his pocket, Sarah's ring, kept safe all these years. "Louise," he said softly, his voice rough with emotion. She turned, flour dusting her cheeks. "Yes?" Stephen crossed to her, taking her hands in his. "You brought life back to this cabin. Back to me." He drew out the ring, its silver gleaming. "Would you make it a true home again? Would you be my wife?" Tears spilled down Louise's cheeks as she nodded. "Yes," she whispered. "Oh, yes." The ring slid perfectly onto her finger, as if it had waited all these years for her news spread quickly. Reverend Thomas offered to perform the ceremony right there at the cabin, where God first brought you together. Louise agreed, her eyes shining. In the days that followed, Louise worked on her wedding dress, transforming the buffalo robe that had once covered her naked shame into a garment of beauty and dignity. Her strong fingers guided the needle surely, each stitch a testament to how far she had come from that desperate night at Stephen's door. From rescue to romance, she mused, holding the finished dress against herself. God does work in mysterious ways. Stephen watched her, his heart full of wonder at how love could bloom from the deepest winter of his soul. Sunlight streamed through the cabin windows on the wedding day, turning dust motes to floating gold. Settlers and Utes filled the small space, their shoulders touching as they gathered to witness the union. Reverend Thomas stood before the stone fireplace, his Bible open in weathered hands. Henry Black Elk took his place as witness, his presence bridging two peoples brought together by Louise's generous heart. The cabin glowed with lamplight against the rough-hewn logs, warming the faces of those gathered. Louise stood radiant in her transformed buffalo robe dress, now a testament to survival and dignity. The careful stitching caught the light, making the dark fur gleam. Whispers of admiration replaced the cruel mockery of months past. Stephen's eyes shone with pride and wonder as he took her hand. Their vows rang clear and true in the hushed room. After the Reverend pronounced them man and wife, the cabin filled with joyful hymns. Voices lifted in harmony, celebrating not just the marriage, but the healing of old wounds between neighbors. As evening painted the sky in soft purples, Stephen and Louise stepped onto the porch. They gazed across the valley she had saved through her wisdom and mercy. Stephen wrapped his arm around her waist, drawing her close. 10 years I thought I was dead inside, he murmured against her hair. But God sent you to my door. Louise smiled through tears, leaning into his embrace. The lonely mountain man had found his heart again, along with a wife, a family, and hope for all the days ahead. Thanks for spending a moment here with me. If this story touched you, let's keep this connection going. Hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.